We're still in the middle of the 4th century, looking at some of the major changes that have taken place during this time. We've been looking at political and cultural changes, and so I want to turn now to thinking about some doctrinal changes and some ways in which doctrine really came front and center in a lot of ways during that 4th century. And there are a couple of major issues that will set the stage for a lot of the rest of what follows throughout the Middle Ages regarding the scope of certain debates, the outline of certain debates, and really what kind of issues are at stake. There are a couple major issues that come up during the 4th century, and one of the biggest ones was the question of Jesus. Specifically, it had to do with the nature of Jesus as the Son of God. What did that mean that Jesus was the Son of God? How was Jesus divine? How was he human? How was he both? Now, previous centuries, a lot of this discussion wasn't really fleshed out very well. When you look at the New Testament, for example, a lot of the early Christian literature, there really wasn't an enormous attempt to try and intricately spell out what Jesus as the Son of God meant. Now, certainly there are references to Jesus as the Son of God, and there are passages which refer to Jesus as God, and others that could be understood in that way, but what that meant was not something that was very well elaborated. How is it that Jesus is both God and human? So we kind of, for the 21st century, take it for granted, for most Christians, that he was. And we look at it as being something very important to who Jesus is and his work, but not much of that is necessarily built on a biblical foundation. And if we try to make any sort of attempt to describe it, we are actually kind of stepping beyond the biblical text. For some, the allegorical method became a way to address this question without trying to really have any sort of philosophical contradictions. When you think about it, of course, the issue at stake is how does something divine, something unchangeable, something all-powerful, all-knowing, reside in something human? And so for the next couple centuries, there's a big debate that will rage at different points and in different places over this very idea. Should we emphasize one or the other? How do we emphasize both? And so for some Christians in those early centuries, the allegorical methods, that these things were symbols or figurative type of language, was useful to try and get around some of the difficult philosophical questions that arose. For the 2nd century apologists, the Logos doctrine became a way to address this, right? The universal reason of God made flesh. And we talked about how, for some of those early Christians, they're talking about Jesus as God, but they're also talking about him as being less than God, right? And so there's kind of this difficulty in trying to say, what Jesus as God means. How can God be both one and yet three? And so Jews would argue that Christians believe in more than one God. And then Muslims later on would pick up on this as well. If you're talking about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you cannot have three and make them one. And of course, we talked about how a variety of heresies developed that were attempts to try and describe this. And so the idea of Jesus being a human being who was adopted by God. And Jesus was human but adopted divinity. Or the ideas of modalism. Right? That Jesus, or that God just appeared in various different modes, wore different masks. We talked about this towards the end of the 3rd century in talking about the Patripassianism, the idea that the Father suffered on the cross. Things that, of course, today we think would be blatantly heretical. How could we say that God suffered on the cross? The Son suffered on the cross. Yet, again, how do you address this unity? The first major remembered controversy on this issue, especially in the 4th century, was the one that started fairly early in the 4th century, the first decade, and is named after the major player for the heresy, a man named Arius. So I want to introduce you to a few individuals that are playing their roles here. First is Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria. He will kind of set off the controversy in some of his sermons. Also involved, the major player on the other side, is a man named Arius, a presbyter who is attempting to figure out this issue of Jesus and Jesus being the Son of God. Another player in all of this is a man named Hosius. Hosius is Bishop of Rome at the time, and he is kind of tangentially connected with this, since much of this is happening in Alexandria, but he will be involved in this, and also are the two Eusebii, or Eusebiuses, whatever the plural would technically be of that. One from Nicomedia, and the historian we've been introduced to earlier, Eusebius of Caesarea. And then finally, our last major player in all of this is the Emperor Constantine. All right, so we have bishops, we have presbyters. What starts as a localized issue in Alexandria will spread elsewhere throughout the East, and will even draw in the West as well. And much of it starts when the Bishop of Alexandria, Alexander, preaches a sermon on Jesus and Jesus' role in a variety of things. And Arius feels that Jesus is being glorified too much in Alexander's sermon. Now, that might sound impossible to us who accept Jesus' divinity. How can you glorify Jesus too much? But Arius is uncomfortable with the language that is being used. And so, he's basically concerned about this issue of, has Jesus as the Logos, right? So Jesus of Nazareth has not always existed. And that much is true. Jesus of Nazareth was born. But Jesus as Logos, has the Logos fully, always existed, was fully God? Or was the Logos a created being? Meaning that he didn't always exist. He was not God. Although the Logos would certainly be the pinnacle of creation for Arius, the concern is that there's too much of the plurality being emphasized. And so Arius suggests, quote, there was when he was not. And the idea is that there was a time when the Logos did not exist, that the Logos was a created being. And Arius feels, for example, that Alexandria, if you take Alexander's position, you are going to be holding to there being more than one God. Sides begin to be taken. More and more people side with Arius, and Alexander is convinced that this idea is going to die off. Nobody's going to hold on to it. But Arius gets bolder, and it gains more and more support. Arius believes that he is very orthodox. He is focusing on the unity of God. God is theos, the God. Christ is theos, a God. And now, again, you might say, okay, well, that's kind of, how do you fit that into all of this? But for Arius, the use of theos here means that he's a divine being, right? There's something special about the Logos, but he hasn't always existed. The support Arius gets moves Alexander to remove him from his post. People take to the streets supporting Arius, chanting Arius' poem, the Thalia. Here's just a part of it. And so God himself, as he really is inexpressible to all. He alone has no equal, no one similar, and no one of the same glory. We call him unbegotten in contrast to him who by nature is begotten. And so there's that issue as well. This idea of Jesus being begotten. How can Jesus be begotten if he's always God? We praise him as without beginning in contrast to him who has a beginning. We worship him as timeless in contrast to him who in time has come to exist. Right? It's kind of catchy, right? You can be thinking about this the rest of the day. Humming it along as you go head over to the cat. He who is without beginning made the Son a beginning of created things. He produced him as a son for himself by begetting him. He has none of the distinct characteristics of God's own being, for he is not equal to, nor is he of the same being as him. God is wise, for he himself is the teacher of wisdom, sufficient proof that God is invisible to all. He is invisible both to things which were made through the Son, and also to the Son himself. I will say specifically how the invisible is seen by the Son, by that power by which God is able to see, each according to his own measure. The Son can bear to see the Father, as is determined. So there is a triad, not in equal glories. Their beings are not mixed together among themselves. As far as their glories, one infinitely more glorious than the other. The Father in his essence is a forerunner to the Son, because he exists without beginning. Understand the monad eternally was, but the dyad was not before it came into existence. It immediately follows that although the Son did not exist, the Father was still God. Hence the Son, not being eternal, came into existence by the Father's will. He is the only begotten God, and this one is alien from all others. And so, again, to us, this sounds foreign. How could somebody claim to be a follower of Christ, yet not claim the divinity of Jesus, or argue that Jesus had a beginning? How does this relate to all sorts of issues, including salvation, if Jesus is but another part of God's creation? Alexander calls for a synod. A synod essentially is a gathering of bishops, and he excommunicates Arius. Arius goes on tour, so to speak. He starts traveling to various places, meets Eusebius of Caesarea, writes to Eusebius of Nicomedia, all in an effort to gain some support. Again, Arius sees himself as championing God's unity. God is Hathaios, the God. Scripture says that Jesus was begotten, which means he was created, according to Arius. Now, by now, Constantine, fully under control of his empire, and so he asks Hosius, Bishop of Rome, to get involved in this issue, right? Because controversy, right, is not something that Constantine wants to see. And so he accuses these bishops of just arguing for argument's sake. That this is not anything of substance. Which, of course, we can see, from our position several centuries removed. Well, no, this is a pretty important matter. But Constantine, who's had very little education in Christianity, has very little experience, looks at it as just being an argument about words. Both sides accuse the emperor of meddling in all this, right? That he's getting involved where he doesn't need to be. When it comes to God and Jesus being the Son of God, Arius argues that God created the Son from nothing, right? So he kind of creates him from nothing, but he's still created. The term Son, then, is meant to be a metaphor, an honorific title. It is not meant, according to Arius, that they share the same substance. So Son of God is not any sort of notion about the essence or substance of Jesus. In fact, argues Arius, two beings cannot share the same substance. So it would be impossible for God to be more than one and yet one. Any sort of sharing must involve subordination. One must be over the other. In attempting to address this question, not only is Scripture being appealed to, but a variety of early Christian thinkers are appealed to, people like Origen, for example. But the thing of it is that most of the people that are being referred to are being used by both sides because of the ambiguity that had existed prior to this point. Most of the early Christians after the New Testament had been just as ambiguous as the New Testament had been. But by now, Alexander is really concerned because he believes that Arius is demeaning Jesus, and he's demeaning the idea of grace, salvation. There's all sorts of topics that are involved in this question of whether or not Jesus is God. So once again, Alexander calls for a synod. This one is held in Antioch. And again, Arius is condemned, but this time Eusebius of Caesarea is condemned as well. Now Eusebius, again, is very close to the emperor, and so it's very bold to condemn the emperor's right-hand bishop. But also, it does not appear that Eusebius really sided with Arius. It appears that he's trying to follow Constantine's guidelines of trying to bring these sides together. And so he's trying to find a middle ground where the two sides can agree and compromise. Well, for the Orthodox side, that a compromise would be essentially heresy, and so he's condemned as well. Constantine is informed that the divisions are not going to be healed, and so he is very concerned that this is going to destroy his newly unified empire. So he calls for a council. Not just a gathering of bishops, but a gathering of substantial authority that will make a universal decision on this matter. The council will meet in the city of Nicaea, which is near to Constantinople. It was meant to be an ecumenical council. Now, what ecumenical in this context means is worldwide. But mostly, the bishops that show up are from the Eastern or Greek-speaking part of the empire. There's very few people from the Western or Latin side. In fact, Sylvester, who was Bishop of Rome at the time, Hosius was left, he died off. Sylvester is unable to come, and so there's a relatively small group of bishops that come from the West. There are a variety of numbers that are advanced from this. Some suggest 318, 250 is more likely. The major issue, of course, is the Arian heresy. What to do about Arius and whether this is truth or it is heresy. But it also dealt with a variety of other issues, like when Easter should be observed. We talked about that before. What about giving the Eucharist to those that are about to die? What about bishops? Can they move from one area to another? So there's a variety of things that they consider, but the Arian controversy is the one that's front and center, and it's the one that's most remembered. Essentially, there are four groups. Three major ones and then a minor one. There is the group, of course, that is following Arius. And so there's the Arian group. The other group, the other major group, of course, is the Orthodox group, who are being led by Alexander. Right? So the Arian group is actually led by Eusebius of Nicomedia. The Orthodox group led by Alexander. Then there is a small group of people who disagree with Arius, but don't support the Orthodox position. And so they're kind of, they're off, but they're off in a different direction. And then the largest group appears to be a group of moderates, right, who aren't firmly in one camp or the other. These are led by Eusebius of Caesarea. They don't really have a distinct position here because they're trying to find some middle ground.